In the last lecture, we led off with the storming of the Bastille. So, the way that you have to imagine things is that the Paris mob has now given the Legislative Assembly in um, Paris control of France. And now the decision is with these, remember, third estate, mostly elected um, people, of how now to bring forth these enlightened ideals and create a new country. I mean, to me, this is really fascinating. What we're going to see within the next 2 years is first they're going to debate what to do, and then it's going to bring a civil war and terror throughout France. And many people are going to die as they're trying to give rights and egalitarianism, remember that term, to the people of France. Now, what you need to realize is kind of the temperature of France at this period of time. So, in 1789, right around the same time, the women are marching to Versailles, demanding bread from Louis XVI. And at the same period of time is where you have the Great Fear and the peasant uprising sweeping throughout the countryside. The National Assembly, if you remember, it's still part of the three estates, and the National Assembly is basically the third estate. But members of the clergy and the nobility are standing up, and they are leaving the first two estates and joining the National Assembly. Um, so what you're going to see happen now is basically the Paris mob has given the National Assembly legitimacy, and now the question is what they're going to do. So the first thing that they do is they begin to reform France, and there's something called the August Decrees. Now, in your notes, it doesn't call it the August Decrees, but as members of the first two estates begin to give away their privilege, and make sure you understand that concept of privilege. So they're basically saying, like, I'm not a lord anymore. I'm going to go join the people. And I don't know whether this was like more opportunism, where they just saw that the people of France had shifted allegiances, um, but some people actually started to give up their privilege, their rights. So the assembly in the August Decrees, the first thing they do is they attack church privilege. They begin to institute rules for a state bureaucracy based on merit rather than birth or, like I said, privilege. They declare complete religious freedom, all right, and the abolition of slave in the colonies. So just right away, they're giving everyone rights. And what they come up with is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in 1789. A 17-article document, and it offered equality for all before the law. Now think about this. Before, the church had different laws, and they were in church courts, and the nobility had different laws in different parts of the country. Fathers could actually put their sons in jail because they were the ruler over their kids. So the question then becomes, who? I mean, you're saying rights of man and citizen, and if you notice, it does not include woman in there. So the actual um, words in it is liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. All right. Now, what were they looking at? All right, what things were they looking to reform? They were looking at censorship. They wanted to end. All right, unfair taxes, which we've talked about, being imprisoned without a trial. It lists freedoms such as the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom from arbitrary arrest, and the idea that you are innocent until proven guilty. And then obviously equal access to public office and taxation. Religious freedoms were debated, actually. Now, if you remember, in France, you have the Huguenots, which are the Protestants, you have the Catholics, which is primarily Catholics, and you have some Jews. And the question is, who is going to be free? Um, the If you look towards the end of the notes here, it talks a little bit about women. Women were not included in this. Now, you have to remember, many women are in France are reading, writing, printing, and running these clubs that are popping up all over France, debating people's rights. Um, and women were lobbying for things like legal divorce. All right, they wanted women to be recognized as full adults at 25. They wanted schools, and this Olympia du Gouges, I'm not sure if I'm not saying her name right, she was the leader of this, and she wrote the um, Declaration of the Rights of Women, I think it was called, um, saying that both men and women were capable and that women were capable of moral reasoning. She blamed education. And now, if you remember, Tabula Rasa, the thinker who came up with that idea, that was Locke. All right, the idea that it's everybody's born with a blank slate and we learn these ideas. So she was saying if you provided education to women, that they would be able to be reason the same as men. So the National Assembly meets, and their goal is to develop a form of government and a constitution. Now, remember, it's been 2 years since they locked themselves out in a tennis court and declared that they would not leave until they would write a constitution. So in 2 years, they had not written a constitution. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to actually decentralize power. All right, so they want to give rights from a king or a sole ruler back to the people, and they want to do this in a scientific way. Well, one of the next things that they do after the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the August Decrees is they pass the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. Now, to me, this is pretty crazy. Now, if you remember, France is very Catholic. Now, the parts of France that are going to be more religious are going to be the upper class, because it provides what? A hierarchy. And the lower class, who aren't as well read and who are more peasants and are going to rely on faith. Now, the middle class people, and this is the people who are running the assembly, these merchants, bankers, are going to be well read and they're going to be new money, and they are going to be more secular. All right, now we should know that term. So they want to get power into the hands of the people. Now, in 1790, where the Eiffel Tower stands today, there was this giant amphitheater, and they had this festival of federation on the 1-year anniversary of the Bastille. And in the center, they had this new altar of the nation. So instead of a church altar, it was a altar of the nation. And they had a mass, and it was celebrated by the bishop. And all the National Guardsmen had to give an oath of loyalty, and Louis the 16th and Marie Antoinette had to give an oath of loyalty to the state. All right, so think about that. So privilege is breaking down, and instead of people being loyal to the king, the same king who went out on his coronation and was curing people with his hand, with the touch, is now professing that his power to the state. Now, this is nothing that he is going to follow through on or believe in, but you got to remember the Paris mob is pretty much beginning to control the whole of France, and times are really tough. He just got pulled back to the Tuileries Palace from Versailles by the women. So what they do next under the civil constitution of the clergy is they nationalize the church. Now, if you remember, this happened in Great Britain. And when I talked about it, I said it seems surprising that people were just willing to change their faith. But in Great Britain, if you remember, the Anglican Church was very similar to Catholicism anyway, so the changes were subtle, and this ended up taking place, and they had their own civil wars over the course of time. And the hold of Catholicism wasn't as strong in Great Britain as it was in France. So they decided to nationalize the church, making the church subordinate to the state. Well, what does this mean? And if you think about it today, this is like amazing, because this is very different than how the United States is set up. So if you remember, the church in that period of time held high positions, had power. People were paying 10% of their whatever salary slash hay, farm, whatever it was, production to the church, and they were taxing people on top of that. So they were very rich. So over the next 10 years, what you're going to see is church lands are going to be taken over by the state. All right, and those lands are going to be sold to fund some parts of this revolution. Very similar to what we talked about with Henry VIII in Great Britain. Now, people were very critical of the church, not only for the corruption, but they called them the contemplative orders, like people who just sit around and think all day, which is funny in the time of the Enlightenment. But the church wasn't looked at as someone who was producing anything of merit. But the church did have a role in life in that period of time. So they served the poor, they ran schools, and now things are going to change. That's not going to be the church's role anymore. It's going to be the government's role. So the civil constitution of the clergy, the state began to pay the salaries of clergymen, all right, which actually raised the salary for priests, who are the lower level of that state, but lowered the salary for bishops. So they're going to even things out. Remember, that's what we mean by egalitarian. So priests now would be elected, and they would take an oath of loyalty to the nation, the law, and the king. So as radical as things are right now, France is still, or the people of France are still more believing in a government that is similar to Great Britain. Now, this act was condemned by the Pope, and it upset a lot of Catholic people. Now, some priests who committed the act of loyalty or professed the act of loyalty became constitutional clergy. They were servants of the people, while others became non-jurors, servants of God. They refused to give the oath of loyalty. So it splits France. So amidst all this turmoil, the king and queen in 1791 in June and the royal servants just go missing. And rumors begin to circulate that they were kidnapped. And these rumors are actually purposely orchestrated because they're trying to cover up for Louis XVI. So Lafayette, still around, and the National Guard declare that he's kidnapped, but he had fled. He had traveled in disguise, hoping to escape to the Austrian Netherlands. So he's trying to get. Now, if you remember, Marie Antoinette was Austrian. So these foreign monarchs who are seeing all these things going on and are worried, whites to the people, are looking to protect them, but they weren't willing to go into France to do it. So Louis tries to escape. And Marie Antoinette in the background had been corresponding with her brother, who's the Austrian emperor. And he said if they got out of France, all right, he would help them out. So Louis and Marie are in a carriage with the royal family, and they get stopped, and people recognize them, but no one really knows what to do. I mean, this is insane that the king can travel incognito anywhere. Go ahead. But someone does stop him eventually, and royal troops find him, and they take him back to Paris. Now, the National Guardsmen identify him. His identity is confirmed, and they bring him back to Paris. And Louis claims that he had fled for his safety and he did not plan to leave the country. Now, most people at this time believe this, and remember, he's still pretty popular. It was the press that hated him. The people liked him, probably not as much the people of Paris, but definitely the people of France. So he gets back. Well, the only issue is with covering up this lie that he fled and was not trying to get out, with that he was actually just trying to flee from problems in Paris, is that he left behind these letters that were critical, highly critical of the revolution. Now, the Lafayette actually tries to cover all this up. All right, so it was still put out that he was kidnapped. But when these letters come out, this is going to really, really radicalize the revolution. Now, if you like, why would Lafayette try to save Louis XVI? That's basically just because he believed in a constitutional monarchy. All right, he did not want he did not want a republic. So there's this debate right now. Now, most people now are not very extreme in their beliefs, but now all of a sudden, when this rumor circulate that he flees, we're going to move into an era of, or a short period of, extreme radicalism in the form of the revolution. All right, so at this point, the king tries to flee. He's caught. They try to cover it up that he was kidnapped. but rumors are circulating, and most people, especially within the legislative or constitutional assembly, understand that the king was trying to leave. Now, this is going to, like I said, ignite the radical left side, and it's going to create a debate. And as the National Assembly approves the new constitution, it's now called the legislative. It'll be called the Legislative Assembly. That just means that when that was the National Assembly, there was no written laws that gave them power. And now that the new constitution is written, a new group of people are going to be elected. And now they actually have the power to create laws. Now, remember, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, just like the Declaration of Independence, was not a law. All right, it wasn't approved by the people or by the king or by anyone. It was just a declaration. It was just kind of posting out to the world what their goals were. So there's going to be debate about what they want to do. And like I said, most people wanted a constitutional monarchy. They just wanted to limit the power of the kings. So after this debate with Louis, there's going to be a group of conservatives who don't really want that much change. They want a bicameral legislature, much like Great Britain, which means that there's going to be like a noble house, almost like our Senate, that will be have a great deal of power to check the power of the people, which will be the second part of the legislature. So now the more liberal people are going to want a much more unicameral legislature so that people have more power. And the factions that begin to emerge, I think you really got to kind of know these. So if you imagine in the assembly, and this is where we get the idea of right and left, on the right side were the conservatives, the monarchists. I just went over what they wanted. On the left side sat these Jacobins, we're going to call them. There was a lot of left-leaning different groups, but the Jacobins are going to be the ones that are radical, that are going to emerge. Many of them are going to sit up in these rafters at the top in the back, and they're going to be called the Mountain, and they're going to be screaming, and they're going to be yelling out things and demanding rights for the people, which, if you have to remember, in the streets of Paris, the sans culottes, those without knee breeches, are on the bottom of the notes there. They are going to be extremely, extremely radical. And what's going to end up happening is the Jacobins, even though they're middle class, they're not these tradesmen that are the sans culottes. The sans culottes were the former bricklayers and people who worked in the cities who were really, really poor. And the Jacobins are going to be much more the middle class people who were just very leftist leaning, and they're going to kind of merge together. On the other side of the left were the Girondins. All right, they were more conservative than the Jacobins, so they hated the Paris mob. All right, and they wanted the king to have a little bit more control. They wanted war. All right, the conservatives wanted war, and the Jacobins did not want war. A lot of them didn't at this period of time. So there's these divisions developing on how much power they want in the king, what they want to do with the king, and more as time goes on, this sans culotte, because they're serving in Paris, are going to really, really influence the assembly. The title of this slide is War. It should be War ? Because I'm going to talk a little bit about how the divisions looked at the impending war, including foreign nations. So after Louis and his family had fled, and a period of time passed where they tried to cover it up, the news of his letters criticizing the government reaches the ears of the public. By July, after he was declared kidnapped, thousands of men and women are signing petitions denouncing these actions and calling for a new government. And the National Guard with Lafayette declares martial law in Paris. So there's this like foment in Paris that wants to get rid of Louis the 14th. Louis the 16th. I'm sorry. This is when Louis signs the new constitution, which creates a single chamber legislature. If you remember, two chambers would be more power to the upper class, and a single chamber legislator would be more power to the voting public. Most people at the time, though, really did not believe in a republic. So at the same time, foreign nations look at this, and Austria and Prussia specifically issue this declaration. They're scared. They don't want us. They're seeing that a king could be deposed in another country by their people, and think that this could happen in their countries. And actually, in Sweden, there was a revolution that overthrew the king in Sweden. So this thing could ignite all throughout Europe. Um, and they issued the Declaration of Pillnitz, all right, which basically it was a threat. They never actually thought that it would lead to war, but they're saying you better take care of Louis the 16th. If anything happens to him, we will declare war. So what does this do? It ends up really just inciting the mob of people in France. So eventually, the Legislative Assembly is forced to declare war. Now, what did people in France think of war? The Jacobins, which were the radical liberals, actually didn't want war because they thought that they needed to stop the counter revolution within France. They needed to stop the nobility and the peasants who were revolting against these changes. The Girondins, who were the more conservative group of the liberals, they wanted war because they wanted to spread the revolution abroad, which is kind of contradictory. They wanted their own rights, but then they wanted to determine in other countries to spread this revolution. And this is why foreign countries are going to find this like really alarming. And there was the conservatives who wanted war because they actually thought that like Louis XVI wanted war because he thought that France would lose, and by losing the war, these foreign countries would come in and save him. So it's kind of crazy. So as this is happening, France is going to do very poorly early in the war. They're not ready. I mean, they have an army that's been dismantled by all the changes, and they are getting mass conscription and getting people ready. At this period of time, there's a riot that's in your notes right there in France. So, like I said, everything's on edge, and they basically come into the Tuileries, Paris, and they massacre the royal guards. And Marie Antoinette and Louis and their children are imprisoned. And then now, all of a sudden, the troops are sent out because they are losing the war, and the Paris mob has gained control of France. Now, and this is kind of the period of time where the Jacobins now are going to align themselves with this Paris mob. So, Louis XVI declares war. You got to remember, even though he is under house arrest or whatever, he is still the king of France. And Prussia and Austria are at the borders of France. Now, at this period of time, all these rumors are circulating, and this concept of counter revolution is beginning within France. People think that as foreign countries invade, it's going to give a chance for the nobility to take control again, and these people voices are going to get stronger throughout France. At the same period of time, soldiers are being recruited for the war, and tons of people are showing up in Paris. So there's this crazy mixture of the people who had always lived in Paris, people from other countries who are coming in that are revolutionary people, and now you have all these people who are signing up and volunteering to go to war as they see that or they feel that foreign countries are going to come in and steal them of their rights. But it's also going to lead to really intensify some of the things that are happening, the divisions that are happening within the assembly. So these parish mobs, like I said in the last lecture, at some point break into the palace, and they demand that Louis XVI be arrested. And what ends up happening is the assembly now declares that France is in danger and sets aside the Constitution and declares emergency powers. And I would say this is like dangerous period where where you give our government or any government a tremendous amount of power. As this is happening, like I said, Robespierre, He's going to be the famous revolutionary. He stands up in the assembly and calls for the removal of the king. The next day, and Robespierre kind of aligns himself with the sans culotte. He plays to the crowd, and I mean, he's not really considered the most dynamic of people, but somehow he ends up being the head of this movement. At midnight, they ring the bells of Paris. This reminds me of Game of Thrones for any Game of Thrones fans. And 2,500 men marched towards the palace. The National Guardsmen were just completely outnumbered, and the revolutionaries had taken the palace. So a new commune had created the republic, meaning that these people of Paris, all right, had actually taken control of all of France because they wanted these egalitarian reforms. The king is sent to prison. All right, they hold new elections for a national convention, and they want universal manhood suffrage. And the people that emerge, like I said, is Robespierre, all right, who's going to be the head of the Jacobins, and then we have this man, Jean-Paul Marat, all right, and Georges Danton. Danton's a lawyer who threw himself into politics. And he is going to just incite this mob. He's the one who calls for 30,000 volunteers to defend Paris. In September, the new National Convention met for the first time, and this is in 1792. And in their first act, they ban the monarchy and they declare a republic. The day before this, and I'm going to talk about this more in the next slide, the new Patriot Army had routed the Prussians, and actually the war was turning in the side of France. So you could just imagine what it's like just sweeping through Paris in this period of time. So the king then is arrested. He is declared a criminal, and there's this fear of counter-revolution that is happening, as well as the fear of foreign countries coming in. So some people wanted to keep the king alive to buffer against like radicals, all right, so that they could temper this heat that's happening in Paris. So the debate happens: what are we going to do with the king? At this period of time, letters were found containing evidence of bribes to counter-revolutionaries. So it's actually found that Louis was trying to actually start this counter-revolution. So they accuse him as an ordinary citizen. They actually call him Louis Capet, which is the family name that I've talked about a little bit in the past, against liberty of the people. So that is the crime. Remember, we talked about how in Great Britain that the king was charged with a crime against himself, but it was changed to a crime against the people. Louis denies everything, but it didn't matter. He was convicted with a vote of 387 in favor to 334, so it was close, in favor of execution. Marie Antoinette is going to face trial 9 months later. On January 21st, 1793, so much is happening in a short period of time. Louis professed his innocence in front of the crowd. The drum rolls, the blade of the guillotine falls, and a cry went up, "Long live the Republic! Long live liberty!" So this was a major event, and this is going to change not only politics in France, but it's also going to change how this is viewed throughout the world. Now, in countries like Great Britain, in the beginning of this revolution, they looked on and actually looked up to what was going on, thinking that they would form a government more like Great Britain. In America, they actually supported the revolution, but this act where they killed their king in public actually turned the tide, and countries like Great Britain and America now watched in horror. And it's going to start a debate throughout the world about power and the nature of power. Okay, now we're going to return to this war. Now, right as the new republic was forming, all right, the Prussians had crossed the eastern border and were 150 miles from Paris. So this led to like just wave of hysteria. And this is when Parisians are going to attack prisons, and there's going to be just violence as all these people are coming into Paris. in September, the Prussians and former French nobility, they were called émigrés, the ones who left France, had taken Verdun, and they're like 150 miles from Paris. And there's this strange battle where a Prussian uh, general failed to engage the French, and they don't really know why. That they kind of had the French on the run, and the French troops end up winning. This is the Battle of Verdun, and this is going to turn the tide of the war. So the French win this big battle, and some of this is said to, and this is something my dad always said, is never getting engaged in someone else's revolution. Because the French troops were fighting for something, like an idea, and the Prussian troops and the Austrian troops were not fighting for anything for themselves. But regardless, I said, um, the Prussian army lost, and the French army fought with a purpose. And the Prussian army had the French on the run and could have won the war, but the French win. After this, there's a draft, and the French army goes to the from by 1794 to from 650,000 men to more than 1,000,000. All right, and this is going to be the largest uh, army in Europe. After this, France is going to go on the offensive, and they're going to declare, this is right around the same time, right after they win this first battle of Verdun, they declare the Republic, they go on the offensive, and they try to spread the revolution throughout Europe. Right? They invade all these countries, and try to free the people from oppression of monarchists and absolutist rule. And this is what's going to bring Great Britain into the war, which had kind of been sitting on the sidelines for all this time. And when they invade all these countries, they are going to declare that the people to be free, and they're going to it's basically going to make things worse, because all these other foreign countries are going to look and they're going to be scared, and what's going to happen is they're going to face a huge coalition of foreign countries, and it's going to lead to basically France versus the rest of the world. Now, the crazy part of this revolution is this fact that not only was France at war with basically the rest of the world, at the same time they're fighting this war with the rest of Europe, there's a civil war within France. So let's explain, and I've kind of talked about how these factions have developed, but in 1793, there's a counter-revolutionary uprising. Now, the biggest threat to revolution is always counter-revolution. All right, this is one of the things that later on Lenin, why he was so extreme, is he was always trying to root out counter-revolution, and that's what led him just like killing off half of Russia, or Soviet Union. But in 1793, it began in a western part of France called a region called the Vendée. This is where it's going to be the strongest form, and the counter-revolution came not necessarily even from the nobility or former nobility, but it came from the peasants. And you have to remember that the peasants are going to be more religious, so those religious reforms on them are going to be really resented. And within different parts of France, certain peasants were doing better than other peasants. So in northern France and in the Vendée, the peasants actually did better. This is historically owned more of their land, and as the reforms started going around, they tried to be more egalitarian. Their taxes actually went up under the revolution. And to make matters even worse, some of those former emigres or the nobles who had fled were trying to incite this, but this was grassroots. This was people not happy with how they were being governed in this new republic during the revolution. And it wasn't just the religious thing. The big thing that actually kind of incited it is the Jacobins started setting up the National Guard in these areas to try to recruit men for their new army that's growing and growing. And these peasants did not want to be part of the army. So they're paying more taxes. Their religious rights are really being like restricted or practically humiliated. And now they're being recruited to serve into a war. So as this infuriation starts to swell, there's one example where a recruitment officer was stabbed in the heart, and one of the constitutional clergy, remember those are the ones who pledged allegiance to the state, not the ones who still pledged to God. Those were the non-jurors. Um, and they tied them all together with a chain, the people who were recruiting them, shot them, dumped them into a moat, and this like just blew up the whole movement. So um, this was something that they really never could get under control, because this was kind of like a guerrilla warfare thing that started to happen. What we really need to know is that there's two different wars going on. There's wars within France, people who are resenting all this change, and then there is war with basically the rest of the world.